The silence in the marble hallway was deafening. 8-year-old Sophie Martinez stood frozen against the towering oak door of her father's study, her small fists pressed against the cold wood. Through the heavy panels, she could hear the sharp edge of David Martinez's voice cutting through the air like a blade. Absolutely not. Physical contact is forbidden in this household. I've made that crystal clear to everyone on my staff. The words hit Sophie like ice water. She had only wanted to show her father the drawing she'd made in art therapy, a picture of them holding hands under a rainbow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now the colorful paper trembled in her grasp as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. Dr. Patricia Vance's professional voice responded from within the study, measured but firm. Mr. Martinez, your daughter has been through tremendous trauma. Physical affection is crucial for her emotional recovery. The complete absence of nurturing touch is actually making her condition worse. I don't care what your textbooks say, doctor. Touch leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to destruction. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I won't have my daughter suffer the same fate. Sophie pressed her ear closer to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't understand all the big words, but she understood the coldness in her father's tone. The same coldness that had wrapped around their mansion like winter fog ever since the accident 6 months ago. Before she could retreat to her room, the study door swung open with sudden force. David Martinez emerged, his 6-foot frame towering above his daughter. His steel-gray eyes barely glanced at her before moving past, as if she were just another piece of furniture in his perfectly organized world. "Sophie, you shouldn't be eavesdropping," he said without stopping, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision. "Mrs. Patterson will escort you to your room. I have important calls to make." Dr. Vance appeared in the doorway behind him, her kind face creased with concern as she noticed Sophie's crumpled drawing. The child psychologist had been coming to the Martinez estate twice a week since the incident, but Sophie could see the defeat growing in her eyes with each visit. "Mr. Martinez, please reconsider. The session is over, doctor. Mrs. Patterson will show you out." David's voice carried the same tone he used in boardroom negotiations, the one that had built his tech empire from nothing and made him one of the youngest billionaires in California. But wealth couldn't fix what was broken in his relationship with his daughter. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the family for over a decade, appeared as if summoned by magic. Her weathered hands reached toward Sophie, then hesitated mid-air, remembering the rules. The woman's eyes filled with the same frustrated sadness that seemed to haunt everyone who cared about the little girl. "Come along, Miss Sophie," Mrs. Patterson said gently, her British accent thick with emotion. "Let's get you some dinner." As they walked toward the grand staircase, Sophie could hear her father's voice echoing from his study, already deep in conversation about quarterly reports and merger acquisitions. The business world was the only language he spoke fluently anymore. Everything else, especially the messy, complicated world of human emotions, was territory he refused to enter. Sophie's bare feet made no sound on the thick Persian runner as she climbed the stairs. Her father had removed all the family photographs from the walls months ago, leaving behind empty spaces that looked like missing teeth in a smile. The house that once rang with laughter now felt like a museum, beautiful, pristine, and completely lifeless. In her bedroom, Mrs. Patterson set down a tray of untouched food. Sophie barely ate anymore, picking at her meals like a bird afraid of being caught. The housekeeper watched her with worried eyes, her hands clasping and unclasping as she fought against her natural instinct to comfort the child with a hug. "Your father loves you very much, you know," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's just lost right now." Sophie looked up from her barely touched soup, her dark eyes too old for her 8 years. "Mama used to hug me every night before bed. She said hugs were like invisible band-aids that could heal anything. Her voice was so soft that Mrs. Patterson had to lean closer to hear. "But Daddy says hugs are dangerous. He says they make people weak." The housekeeper's heart shattered a little more. She had watched Sophie transform from a vibrant, affectionate child into this silent shadow, who flinched whenever anyone came too close. The no-touch rule that David had implemented after the accident was slowly killing his daughter's spirit, but he refused to see it. "Sometimes grown-ups make rules when they're scared," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, knowing that David had cameras throughout the house and monitored all conversations. "But that doesn't mean the rules are always right." That night, after Mrs. Patterson had left Sophie's room, the little girl lay awake staring at the ceiling. Through her window she could see the lights of Los Angeles sprawling endlessly in the distance, millions of people living their lives while she remained trapped in this beautiful prison of marble and isolation. She thought about her mother, Elena Martinez, whose warmth and laughter had once filled every corner of this house. Elena had been the bridge between Sophie's world and her father's, translating his awkward affection into the hugs and kisses that every child needed. When she died in the car accident that had left Sophie physically unharmed but emotionally shattered, that bridge had collapsed entirely. David had retreated into his work with obsessive intensity, throwing himself into 14-hour days and avoiding any situation that might require emotional vulnerability. He moved through the house like a ghost, providing for Sophie's physical needs while completely ignoring her emotional ones. The few times Sophie had tried to reach out, a tentative touch on his arm, an attempt to climb into his lap, he had gently but firmly moved her away, his face a mask of controlled pain. The next morning brought Dr. Marcus Chen, Sophie's pediatric psychiatrist, for his weekly visit. Unlike Dr. Vance's focus on family therapy, Dr. Chen worked one-on-one with Sophie, trying to help her process the trauma of losing her mother and the secondary trauma of her father's emotional withdrawal. David met with him privately first, as always in the study lined with law books and business awards. Dr. Chen was a slight man with patient eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of person who seemed to absorb other people's pain without judgment. "Her night terrors are getting worse," Dr. Chen reported, his voice gentle but direct. "She's waking up 3 to 4 times a night, calling for her mother. The isolation is compounding her grief in ways that could have lasting effects." David stood with his back to the doctor, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the perfectly manicured grounds of his estate. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged years in just 6 months, his dark hair now streaked with premature silver, his face carved with lines of stress and sorrow. "What exactly are you suggesting, doctor?" "Physical comfort is a basic human need, especially for a traumatized child. Even something as simple as a good-night hug could." "No." The word came out like a gunshot. David turned from the window, his eyes blazing with a pain so raw that Dr. Chen actually took a step backward. "I held my wife's hand for 12 years. I trusted in that connection, believed it made us stronger. Then I watched her die in that hospital bed, and all that touching, all that closeness, it meant nothing. It only made the loss more devastating." Dr. Chen had heard variations of this argument before, but the depth of David's trauma was becoming clearer with each session. The man wasn't just grieving his wife, he was trying to protect himself and his daughter from ever experiencing that level of pain again. Unfortunately, his solution was causing different but equally serious damage. "Mr. Martinez, grief is not something we can avoid by avoiding connection. It's something we work through with support and love. Love failed us, doctor. Love got us nothing but pain." David's voice cracked slightly on the word love, betraying the emotion he worked so hard to suppress. "I provide for my daughter in every way that matters. She has the best education, the finest healthcare, every material comfort. That's love in its most reliable form." But even as he spoke the words, David knew they sounded hollow. He could see the accusation in Dr. Chen's eyes, the same look he'd been getting from Mrs. Patterson, from Dr. Vance, from anyone who spent time around Sophie. They all thought he was a monster, denying his grieving daughter the comfort she desperately needed. What they didn't understand was that every time Sophie reached for him, every time she looked at him with those dark eyes so much like Elena's, he felt like he was drowning. The urge to pull her close, to hold her and promise that everything would be okay, was so strong it physically hurt. But he had made those promises to Elena, had held her hand and sworn that love would conquer everything, right up until the moment the machine stopped beeping and she was gone. He couldn't survive losing Sophie too, and if keeping her at arm's length meant keeping her safe from the devastating pain of deep connection, then he would bear the weight of being seen as the cold, unfeeling father. It was a price he was willing to pay. Dr. Chen finished his session with Sophie an hour later, emerging from her playroom with the same defeated expression that seemed to plague all the professionals who tried to help the Martinez family. Sophie had spent most of the time sitting silently, moving toy figures around a dollhouse while refusing to make eye contact or engage in conversation. "She's retreating further into herself," Dr. Chen told David as Mrs. Patterson showed him to the door. "The longer this continues, the harder it will be to reverse the damage." David watched from his study window as the doctor's car disappeared down the long driveway. He could see Sophie in the garden, sitting alone on the swing set that Elena had insisted they install, despite his protests that it would clutter the pristine landscape. The little girl pumped her legs mechanically, going through the motions of childhood play without any of its joy. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to protect her from pain, he had created a different kind of suffering. But changing course now felt impossible. The walls he had built around his heart after Elena's death weren't just keeping others out, they were keeping him trapped inside his own emotional prison. That evening, Mrs. Patterson knocked on his study door with unusual urgency. The elderly woman had been with the family since before Sophie was born, and David respected her judgment, even when it conflicted with his own decisions. "Mr. Martinez, I need to speak with you about Miss Sophie's care." David looked up from his laptop, noting the formal way she had addressed him. Mrs. Patterson only used that tone when she was about to say something he wouldn't want to hear. "I'm listening." "Sir, I've been caring for children for over 40 years, and I've never seen a child suffering the way Miss Sophie is suffering." Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "She's fading away right before our eyes. The no-contact rule is killing her spirit." "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but no, sir, with all due respect, you need to hear this."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The housekeeper's voice grew stronger, fueled by her love for the child upstairs. "Miss Sophie hasn't smiled in 3 months. She barely speaks above a whisper. She wakes up crying every night and has no one to comfort her. This isn't protection, Mr. Martinez. This is cruelty." The words hit David like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to defend his position, but the truth in Mrs. Patterson's accusation left him speechless. He had become the very thing he had always sworn he would never be, the kind of father who put his own fears ahead of his child's needs. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hold your daughter. Tell her you love her. Let her know that losing her mother doesn't mean losing you too." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "She thinks she's being punished for something, Mr. Martinez. She thinks the reason you won't touch her is because there's something wrong with her." David felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. The thought that Sophie might blame herself for his distance had never occurred to him. In his mind, he was being noble, sacrificial, protecting her from future pain. But from her perspective, she had lost both parents in that accident, one to death and one to fear. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice breaking. Elena was the one who knew how to comfort her. I don't know how to be what she needs without Elena here to show me. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. For the first time in months, she saw not the cold, distant billionaire, but the broken man who missed his wife and was terrified of failing his daughter. You learn by trying, sir. You make mistakes and try again. That's what parents do. But before David could respond, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. Both adults froze for a moment, then raced toward the sound. They found Sophie in her bedroom, thrashing in the grips of another nightmare, her small body tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. "Mama, Mama, don't go. Please don't leave me," she cried, her eyes wide with terror, even though she was still asleep. Mrs. Patterson moved toward the bed instinctively, then stopped, looking at David with desperate eyes. The no-touch rule meant she couldn't wake Sophie with gentle shaking or soothing touches. She could only stand there helplessly, watching the child suffer. David stood frozen in the doorway, his heart breaking as he watched his daughter relive the trauma that haunted both their lives. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to hold her, to chase away the nightmares with his presence. But the wall of fear he had built was too high, too strong. Sophie's screams grew more desperate. "Daddy, where's Daddy? I need my daddy." The words shattered something inside David's chest. His daughter was calling for him, needing him, and he was standing there like a statue while she suffered. Without thinking, he crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of her bed. "Sophie, wake up. It's okay. You're safe." But Sophie was too deep in the nightmare to hear his voice. Her small fists beat against the air, fighting invisible demons. David reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, trembling with the effort of overcoming months of self-imposed isolation. "Sir," Mrs. Patterson whispered urgently. "She needs you." David closed his eyes and let his hand settle gently on Sophie's shoulder. The contact sent a shock through his system, not of pain, but of rightness. This was his daughter. This was his child who needed him. "Sophie, sweetheart, wake up. Daddy's here." At the sound of his voice and the feel of his touch, Sophie's eyes flew open. For a moment, she stared at him in confusion, as if unsure whether she was still dreaming. Then, without warning, she launched herself into his arms. David's first instinct was to pull away, to maintain the boundaries he had so carefully constructed. But the feel of her small body shaking against his chest, the way she clung to him like he was her lifeline, dissolved every wall he had built. His arms came up around her automatically, holding her close for the first time since the funeral. "I thought you didn't love me anymore," Sophie sobbed into his shoulder. "I thought I was bad, and that's why you wouldn't hug me." David felt tears streaming down his face as the full weight of what he had done to his daughter crashed over him. In trying to protect her from the pain of love and loss, he had made her feel unloved and abandoned. He had become the source of her trauma instead of her comfort. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy was scared and made some very bad choices. I love you more than anything in the world. I never stopped loving you." Sophie pulled back to look at his face, her own streaked with tears. "Really, really, I was just afraid that if I loved you too much, something bad might happen to you too. But I was wrong. Love doesn't make bad things happen. Love helps us be strong when bad things do happen." Mrs. Patterson watched from the doorway, tears of relief streaming down her face. This was the breakthrough they had all been praying for, the moment when David finally chose love over fear. For the next hour, David held his daughter as she told him about her nightmares, her fears, and the loneliness that had consumed her since her mother's death. He listened to every word, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously, as he realized how much damage his distance had caused. "Will you stay with me until I fall asleep?" Sophie asked, her voice small and hopeful. "I'll stay as long as you need me to," David promised, settling more comfortably on her bed. As Sophie drifted off to sleep in his arms, David made a silent vow. He would learn how to be the father she needed, even if it meant risking his heart again. Because the alternative, watching his daughter fade away from lack of love, was far worse than any pain that connection might bring. But what David didn't know was that his emotional awakening was about to face its greatest test. 3 floors below, in the servants' quarters, a woman named Maria Santos was packing her meager belongings into a worn suitcase. She had been hired that afternoon by Mrs. Patterson, who was desperately needed help managing the household and caring for Sophie. Maria was a single mother herself, working multiple jobs to support her teenage son. She had cleaned houses, worked in restaurants, and done whatever it took to survive in a city that chewed up people like her and spit them out. But she had heard rumors about the Martinez family, about the billionaire who refused to show his daughter any physical affection, about the little girl who was wasting away from emotional neglect. Maria had almost turned down the job. She had her own trauma to deal with, her own reasons for being wary of wealthy men who wielded their power, without regard for the people around them. But Mrs. Patterson had been persistent, and the pay was too good to refuse. Maria needed the money for her son's college fund, and she told herself she could keep her head down and do the work without getting emotionally involved. She had no idea that walking into the Martinez mansion would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone who lived there. Because Maria Santos had something that all the doctors and therapists in the world couldn't provide, the intuitive understanding of what it meant to heal a broken child through the simple power of human connection. And sometimes, the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places, carried by people who have nothing to lose and everything to give. Maria Santos arrived at the Martinez estate at dawn, her breath visible in the crisp morning air as she walked up the cobblestone path toward the servants' entrance. The mansion loomed before her, like something from a fairy tale, all glass and steel and impossibly perfect landscaping. She clutched her worn leather purse tighter, feeling completely out of place in her simple black dress and comfortable shoes. Mrs. Patterson greeted her at the kitchen door, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying too heavy a burden for too long. The older woman's eyes were kind but wary, and Maria could sense the desperation beneath her professional demeanor. "You must be Maria. I'm so grateful you decided to take the position." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a slight tremor as she spoke. "I know the situation here is rather unusual, but Miss Sophie needs all the help she can get." Maria nodded, setting down her purse on the pristine granite countertop. She had worked for wealthy families before, but nothing had prepared her for the sterile perfection of the Martinez kitchen. Every surface gleamed like something from a magazine, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. "Tell me about the child," Maria said quietly, her accent carrying traces of her childhood in El Salvador. "Mrs. Patterson, what exactly am I walking into here?" The older woman's composure cracked slightly. She glanced toward the doorway, then moved closer to Maria, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "Sophie is 8 years old, and she's been through hell. Lost her mother 6 months ago in a car accident. Since then, her father has forbidden any physical contact in the house. No hugs, no comfort touches, nothing. The child is starving for affection, and it's killing her slowly." Maria felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. She had seen this before in her own life, in her own neighborhood, children suffering because adults were too broken or too selfish to give them what they needed. But this was different. This wasn't neglect born of poverty or addiction. This was calculated emotional deprivation imposed by someone with all the resources in the world to help his child heal. And Mr. Martinez, what kind of man creates such rules? Mrs. Patterson's expression grew complicated. "He's not evil, Maria. He's wounded, lost his wife and doesn't know how to process his own grief, let alone help his daughter with hers. But the result is the same, that little girl is withering away." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of small footsteps echoed in the hallway above. Maria looked up instinctively, her mother's heart already reaching toward a child she hadn't even met yet. "That's her now. She doesn't sleep well, hasn't since the accident. She wanders the house at night sometimes, looking for something she can't name.
Maria closed her eyes briefly, thinking of her own son Diego, now 17 and preparing for college. She remembered the nights when he was small, waking from nightmares after his father left them, how nothing but her arms around him could chase away the demons. The thought of any child going through such darkness without comfort made her soul ache. "Show me to her," Maria said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Mrs. Patterson led her through the mansion's lower level, past rooms that looked like museum displays rather than living spaces. Everything was tasteful, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. There were no family photos, no children's artwork on the refrigerator, no signs that a little girl actually lived in this palace. They found Sophie in the breakfast nook, sitting alone at a table that could have seated 12 people. She was methodically moving cereal around in her bowl without eating, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her pale face. She looked impossibly small in the enormous room, like a single star lost in an empty sky. "Miss Sophie," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "I'd like you to meet Maria. She's going to be helping me take care of the house." Sophie looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Maria's for just a moment before darting away. But in that instant, Maria saw everything she needed to know. This child was drowning in loneliness, her spirit crying out for connection, even as she had learned not to expect it. Maria approached slowly, her instincts telling her to move carefully around this wounded little soul. She sat down across from Sophie, not speaking, just being present. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for a hurting child was simply to exist in their space without demanding anything in return. After several minutes of silence, Sophie spoke in a voice so quiet Maria had to strain to hear it. "Are you going to leave too?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow. She thought of all the people who must have come and gone from Sophie's life since her mother's death. Doctors, therapists, temporary staff, all promising to help, all eventually disappearing. "I don't have any plans to leave," Maria said honestly. "I need this job. And from what I can see, you need someone who's going to stay put for a while." Sophie's spoon paused in its endless stirring. "Daddy says people leave when they get too close. He says it's better not to get attached." Maria felt her heart breaking and her anger growing in equal measure. What kind of man filled his child's head with such poisonous ideas? She thought of her own father, who had died when she was Sophie's age, and how her mother had held her and grieved with her, teaching her that love was worth the risk of loss. "Your daddy is scared," Maria said carefully, knowing that David Martinez might be monitoring their conversation. Sometimes when grown-ups are scared, they make rules that don't make sense. But that doesn't mean the rules are right. For the first time, Sophie looked directly at her, and Maria saw a flicker of something that might have been hope. "Do you have kids?" Sophie asked. "I have a son. His name is Diego. He's 17 now, getting ready for college." "Does he hug you?" The innocence of the question nearly broke Maria's composure. She thought of Diego, who still wrapped his long arms around her every morning before school, who kissed her cheek when he left for his part-time job, who curled up next to her on the couch when a movie made him sad. "Yes, Mia, he hugs me all the time. That's what people do when they love each other." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I can't remember what hugs feel like." Before Maria could respond, the sound of expensive shoes on marble announced David Martinez's arrival. He appeared in the doorway of the breakfast nook, and Maria got her first look at the man responsible for his daughter's suffering. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that graced magazine covers. But his eyes were what struck her most. They held a pain so deep it was almost tangible. This was not the cold, calculating monster she had imagined. This was a man barely holding himself together. "Sophie, you need to finish your breakfast," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Dr. Chen will be here in an hour for your session." His gaze moved to Maria, and she saw him taking her measure. She straightened slightly,
meeting his eyes with steady confidence. She had dealt with powerful men before, men who thought their money could buy compliance and silence. David Martinez might be richer than anyone she had ever worked for, but she would not be intimidated. "You must be Maria," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. "I'm David Martinez. Thank you for joining our staff." Maria shook his hand briefly, noting how he maintained perfect physical distance even in this simple greeting. Everything about his posture screamed of someone who had locked himself away from human connection. "Mr. Martinez," she said simply. An awkward silence fell over the room. Sophie had returned to stirring her cereal, but Maria could see her listening intently to every word. The child was always watching, always hoping for some sign that the adults in her life might find a way to bridge the distance that kept them all isolated. "Mrs. Patterson will explain your duties," David said finally. "If you have any questions, please direct them to her." He started to leave, then paused, looking back at his daughter. For just a moment, his careful mask slipped, and Maria saw the raw love and anguish underneath. This man adored his child, that much was clear, but something was keeping him trapped on the other side of an invisible wall, unable to reach her even though she was right there. "Have a good session with Dr. Chen, sweetheart," he said softly. Sophie looked up hopefully. "Will you sit with me today?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have meetings all morning, but Mrs. Patterson will be nearby if you need anything." The light in Sophie's eyes dimmed, and she returned to her untouched breakfast. David left without another word, and Maria heard his footsteps retreating toward what she assumed was his home office. Over the following days, Maria settled into the rhythm of the Martinez household, and what she discovered disturbed her deeply. This was a family living like strangers, occupying the same beautiful space but never truly connecting. David worked obsessively, leaving early and returning late, communicating with his daughter through the staff rather than directly. Sophie moved through the house like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged by the father she desperately wanted to please. Maria began to notice patterns that Mrs. Patterson had either missed or been too overwhelmed to recognize. Sophie's behavior was worse on certain days, the days when David had been particularly distant, when his work stress spilled over into their home life. The child was hypervigilant, constantly monitoring her father's moods and trying to make herself invisible when he seemed particularly fragile. But there was something else, something that made Maria's trained instincts prickle with unease. David's sister-in-law, Catherine Walsh, had been visiting frequently since Elena's death, bringing elaborate gifts and healthy meals that she insisted were essential for Sophie's recovery. Catherine was Elena's older sister, a successful pharmaceutical sales representative who had never married or had children of her own. Maria first encountered Catherine on a Tuesday morning, when she arrived unannounced with a large basket of organic smoothies and vitamin supplements. She was an attractive woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of aggressive helpfulness that immediately put Maria on guard. "You must be the new housekeeper," Catherine said, looking Maria up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I'm Catherine Walsh, Sophie's aunt. I've been helping David navigate this difficult time." Maria nodded politely, but something about Catherine's proprietary tone raised red flags. The way she spoke about David, the way she positioned herself as indispensable to the family's well-being, it all felt calculated in a way that made Maria uncomfortable. "I've brought some specialized nutrition drinks for Sophie," Catherine continued, unpacking her basket with practiced efficiency. "The child has lost far too much weight, and David is so overwhelmed he can barely keep track of what she's eating." Maria watched as Catherine arranged the smoothies in the refrigerator, noting how she seemed to know exactly where everything belonged. This woman had clearly made herself at home in the Martinez kitchen, and Maria wondered how often these visits actually occurred. When Sophie appeared for lunch, Catherine's demeanor shifted dramatically. She became warm, almost effusive in her attention to the child. "There's my beautiful niece," she cooed, pulling Sophie into what looked like an affectionate embrace.
But Maria noticed how Sophie's body tensed during the contact, how her eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route. "I brought your favorite strawberry smoothie," Catherine said, already pouring the pink liquid into a glass. "Dr. Martinez specifically asked me to make sure you're getting proper nutrition." Sophie accepted the smoothie reluctantly, and Maria saw her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The child took a small sip, then set the glass down quickly, her face pale. "I'm not very hungry, Aunt Catherine." "Nonsense. You need to drink the whole thing. It's packed with vitamins and minerals that will help you grow big and strong, just like your mother wanted." At the mention of her mother, Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she obediently picked up the glass and began drinking, her small face screwed up in concentration as if the act required enormous effort. Maria found herself studying Catherine more closely. There was something about the woman's insistence on the smoothie, something about the way Sophie reacted to it, that didn't sit right. But she couldn't put her finger on exactly what was wrong. The answer came 3 hours later when Sophie was violently ill. Maria found her in the upstairs bathroom, retching into the toilet, while Mrs. Patterson held her hair back and murmured words of comfort. The child's face was grey with nausea, and she was shaking uncontrollably. "This happens sometimes," Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice tight with worry. "The doctors think it might be psychosomatic, her grief manifesting as physical symptoms." But Maria's maternal instincts were screaming that this was something else entirely. She had seen plenty of sick children in her life, and this didn't look like emotional distress. This looked like a physical reaction to something Sophie had ingested. "What did she eat today?" Maria asked. "Just the usual, some toast for breakfast, barely touched." Then the smoothie Aunt Catherine brought. Maria's blood went cold. She thought about Catherine's insistence that Sophie drink the entire smoothie, about the child's obvious reluctance, about the timing of the illness. It could be a coincidence, but her gut told her it wasn't. "Has this happened before after Catherine's visits?" Mrs. Patterson paused in her ministrations, a frown creasing her brow. "Now that you mention it, yes, it does seem like Sophie gets sick more often when Catherine's been here. But she's been so helpful since Elena died. David relies on her so much." Maria helped get Sophie cleaned up and settled back in bed, her mind racing with possibilities. She needed more information, needed to observe the pattern more carefully before she could draw any conclusions.
But every instinct she had developed over years of protecting her own child was telling her that Sophie was in danger. Over the next week, Maria began keeping careful notes of Sophie's symptoms and their timing. She documented every visit from Catherine, every gift of food or supplements, every instance of Sophie becoming ill. The pattern that emerged made her stomach turn with a mixture of rage and horror. Sophie was consistently sick within hours of consuming anything Catherine brought to the house. But the symptoms were subtle enough and spaced out enough that they could easily be attributed to grief or stress. Catherine had found the perfect cover for whatever she was doing to this vulnerable child. But why would Elena's sister want to harm Sophie? What could she possibly gain from making a grieving child sick? The answer came to Maria in fragments, pieced together through careful observation and overheard conversations. Catherine had been in love with David for years, harboring feelings that predated his marriage to Elena. She had watched from the sidelines as her sister built the life Catherine wanted for herself, and Elena's death had given her an opportunity she had never expected. With Elena gone and David emotionally unavailable, Catherine had positioned herself as the family's savior. She was the one who brought healthy food, who offered to help with Sophie's care, who provided a shoulder for David to lean on during his darkest moments. She was making herself indispensable, but Sophie was an obstacle to the relationship she really wanted. A sick, needy child would keep David dependent on Catherine's help. A child who eventually died from mysterious complications would leave David free to find love again, with the woman who had stood by him through his greatest loss. The realization hit Maria like a physical blow. She was watching a woman slowly poison a child, using the cover of family loyalty and medical concern to commit the perfect crime. And David, wrapped up in his own grief and guilt, was blind to what was happening right under his nose. Maria knew she needed proof before she could act. Accusations without evidence would only result in her losing her job and Sophie losing her only ally. So she began to plan, using every skill she had learned from years of survival in a world that preyed on women like her. She started with Sophie's bedroom, searching for any evidence of the supplements and special foods Catherine had been providing. In a drawer of Sophie's nightstand, she found several bottles of vitamins and herbal remedies, all with Catherine's handwritten labels promising various health benefits. Maria photographed each bottle, noting the ingredients and dosages. Some of them seemed harmless enough, but others contained compounds that could cause nausea, weakness, and digestive problems in a child Sophie's size. In larger doses, or combined with certain other substances, they could be genuinely dangerous. Next, Maria began collecting samples of the food and drinks Catherine brought. She saved portions in small containers, storing them in her own room where no one would think to look. She wasn't sure how she would get them tested, but she knew she needed physical evidence of whatever Catherine was using. The breakthrough came when Maria overheard Catherine talking to David in his study. She had been dusting in the hallway when their voices drifted through the partially open door, and what she heard made her blood run cold. "Sophie's condition is getting worse, David. I really think you should consider residential treatment. There are excellent facilities that specialize in childhood trauma and complicated grief. I don't want to send her away, Catherine. She's already lost so much. But what if she can't recover in this environment? What if being here, surrounded by memories of Elena, is actually preventing her from healing? Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is make the hard choice." Maria pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as she listened to Catherine systematically dismantling David's confidence in his ability to care for his daughter. The woman was a master manipulator, using his guilt and fear against him while positioning herself as the voice of reason. "I've been researching programs," Catherine continued. "There's one in Switzerland that has remarkable success rates with cases like Sophie's. She would get round-the-clock care from specialists, and you could visit regularly. It might be exactly what she needs." "I can't," David said, and Maria could hear the anguish in his voice. "I can't lose her too." "You're not losing her, you're giving her the chance to get better." "And David," Catherine's voice dropped to a more intimate tone, "you need to think about your own healing too. You can't take care of her if you don't take care of yourself." Maria had heard enough. She slipped away before she could be discovered, but the conversation confirmed her worst fears. Catherine wasn't just making Sophie sick, she was working to convince David that the child was too damaged to remain at home. Once Sophie was safely tucked away in some foreign institution, Catherine would have David all to herself. That night, Maria sat in her small room staring at the evidence she had collected. She had photographs, samples, and documented patterns, but she still wasn't sure it would be enough to convince David. He trusted Catherine implicitly, relied on her judgment, and was in no emotional state to accept that someone he saw as a lifeline might actually be destroying his daughter. Maria thought about her own son, about the lengths she had gone to protect him from men who might hurt him, from systems that might fail him, from a world that seemed determined to chew up children like them and spit them out. She had fought battles she never should have had to fight, made sacrifices that still kept her awake at night, all because love demanded that she put Diego's well-being above everything else. Sophie didn't have anyone to fight those battles for her. Her father was too broken, too manipulated, too lost in his own grief to see the danger. The other staff members were well-meaning but powerless. The doctors and therapists had been fooled by Catherine's careful deception. That left only Maria, a housekeeper with no credentials, no authority, and no reason anyone should believe her over a respected pharmaceutical professional with a clean reputation and family connections. But Maria had one advantage that Catherine hadn't counted on. She recognized the signs of abuse because she had lived them, she understood manipulation because she had survived it, and she knew what it looked like when a predator used systems and institutions to cover their crimes. Catherine had made one crucial mistake in her careful planning. She had assumed that the new housekeeper would be just another minimum wage worker who would keep her head down and mind her own business. She had never considered that Maria might be a mother who would risk everything to save a child in danger. The next morning, Maria began implementing her own careful plan. She couldn't go to David directly, not yet, but she could start planting seeds of doubt, asking innocent questions that might make him look more closely at patterns he had been too overwhelmed to notice. "Mr. Martinez," she said when she encountered him in the kitchen, "I've noticed that Miss Sophie seems to have more stomach troubles on certain days. Have the doctors mentioned anything about food sensitivities?" David paused in his coffee preparation, frowning slightly. "The doctors have run every test imaginable. They think the nausea is psychological." "Of course," Maria said carefully. "I just wondered if there might be certain foods that make it worse. I could keep track if you think it would be helpful." She saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. Despite his emotional distance, David was still a father who wanted his daughter to feel better. The idea of identifying triggers that might reduce Sophie's suffering appealed to him. "That's actually not a bad idea. Yes, if you could make note of what she eats and when she gets sick, that might help us identify patterns." It was a small victory, but Maria knew that successful revolutions were built on small victories accumulated over time. She was fighting for Sophie's life, and she would use every weapon at her disposal, even if it meant going up against someone with far more power and resources than she would ever have. Because some battles were too important to lose, and some children were worth any risk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor of the Martinez mansion as Maria carefully arranged the evidence she had spent weeks collecting. Spread across her small dresser were photographs, labeled sample containers, and pages of detailed notes documenting every instance of Sophie's mysterious illnesses. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the materials, knowing that today would either save Sophie's life or destroy her own chances of helping the child. 3 days had passed since Maria overheard Catherine's conversation about sending Sophie to Switzerland, and the urgency of the situation pressed against her chest like a weight. She had watched Sophie grow weaker each day, the child's spirit dimming as Catherine's visits became more frequent and her gifts more insistent. Yesterday had been the breaking point. Catherine had arrived with a new supplement, something she claimed would boost Sophie's energy and help her sleep better. She had personally overseen Sophie drinking the entire glass of what looked like a protein shake, standing over the child with maternal concern while Sophie struggled to get it down. 4 hours later, Sophie had collapsed in the garden while playing with the few toys she still showed interest in. Maria had been hanging laundry when she heard the weak cry for help, rushing to find the 8-year-old curled in a ball beside the fountain, her skin pale and clammy, her breathing shallow and rapid. Mrs. Patterson had called the family doctor, who arrived within an hour to examine Sophie. Williams was an elderly physician who had been treating the Martinez family for years, and his examination was thorough but yielded no clear answers. "Her vital signs are stable now, but she's clearly experienced some kind of episode," he told David, who had rushed home from his office when Mrs. Patterson called. "Given her recent trauma and the ongoing emotional stress, it's not unusual for children to manifest psychological distress as physical symptoms." But Maria had seen the timing. She had watched Catherine's satisfaction when Sophie struggled to finish the shake. She had noticed how Catherine lingered after these incidents, positioning herself as the caring family member who would help David through yet another crisis. As Dr. Williams packed his medical bag, Catherine appeared at Sophie's bedside with practiced concern. "Poor darling," she murmured, smoothing Sophie's hair with gentle fingers. "She's been through so much."
David, I really think we need to consider more intensive intervention. These episodes are becoming more frequent. David stood at the foot of his daughter's bed, his face a mask of helpless frustration. Maria could see the war raging behind his eyes, the love for his daughter battling against his paralyzing fear of making the wrong choice. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm not equipped to handle this." "You're doing everything you can," Catherine assured him, her hand moving to rest on his shoulder in what appeared to be a comforting gesture. "But sometimes love means acknowledging when we need professional help." Maria had watched this manipulation unfold with growing horror, seeing how Catherine used David's guilt and fear to push him toward the decision she wanted. The woman was a master at her craft, weaving concern and care around her true intentions so skillfully that even Maria sometimes questioned her own perceptions. But Sophie's reaction to Catherine told a different story. When the child thought no one was looking, her face showed pure fear whenever her aunt approached. She flinched from Catherine's touches, ate reluctantly when Catherine served her food, and had started hiding whenever she heard Catherine's voice in the hallway. Children knew things that adults often missed, and Sophie's instincts were screaming warnings that everyone around her was too distracted to hear. Now, as Maria prepared to risk everything on a desperate gambit, she thought about her own son Diego and the conversation they had had the night before. She had called him from her room, needing to hear his voice and draw strength from the love that had sustained her through every challenge in her life. "Mummy, you sound worried," Diego had said, his voice warm with concern. "Is everything okay at the new job?" Maria had wanted to tell him everything, to pour out her fears and suspicions and ask for his advice. But Diego was focused on his final semester of high school, working hard to maintain the grades that would secure his college scholarships. She couldn't burden him with her problems, not when he had worked so hard to build a future for himself. "There's a little girl here who needs help," she had said instead. "Sometimes doing the right thing is scary. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, Mummy. It's doing what needs to be done even when you're afraid." Diego's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had watched his mother fight battles she shouldn't have had to fight. "Whatever you decide, I trust your judgment." Those words echoed in Maria's mind as she made her final preparations. She had spent the early morning hours copying her documentation onto her phone, creating backups of the evidence in case Catherine somehow discovered and destroyed the originals. She had researched the symptoms of the supplements she suspected Catherine was using, confirming that several of them could cause the exact problems Sophie had been experiencing. Most importantly, she had formulated a plan that would force the truth into the open, regardless of the consequences to herself. Maria gathered her evidence and made her way to David's study, knowing that he would be there preparing for his morning meetings. She found him exactly where she expected, hunched over his laptop with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The man looked like he had aged a decade in the months since his wife's death, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Mr.
Martinez," she said quietly, knocking on the open door. "I need to speak with you. It's about Sophie." David looked up, his expression shifting to polite attention, mixed with the wariness that seemed to characterize all his interactions lately. Maria could see him bracing himself for another report of his daughter's struggles, another piece of evidence that he was failing as a father. "What is it, Maria? Is she feeling better this morning?" "That's what I need to talk to you about." Maria stepped into the study, closing the door behind her. The gesture seemed to register with David, his posture straightening as he recognized the seriousness of her manner. "I believe Sophie is being poisoned." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation, stark and impossible to ignore. David's face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, and then a flash of anger. "That's a very serious allegation, Maria. What are you suggesting?" Maria had rehearsed this moment, knowing that she would have one chance to present her case before David either listened or dismissed her entirely. She placed her folder of evidence on his desk, her hands steady despite the racing of her heart. I've been documenting Sophie's symptoms for weeks. Every time she gets sick, every time she has an episode, it happens after she's consumed something that Catherine brings to the house. David's expression hardened. Catherine is family. She loved Elena like a sister, and she's been invaluable in helping us through this difficult time. I won't listen to. Please, Maria interrupted, her voice firm but respectful. Just look at the evidence. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the facts. Something in her tone must have penetrated his defensiveness, because David opened the folder and began examining the contents. Maria watched his face as he reviewed her carefully documented timeline, the photographs of the supplements, the correlation between Catherine's visits and Sophie's illnesses. This could all be coincidence, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sophie has been traumatized. Her immune system is compromised. She's psychologically fragile. Yes, she is, Maria agreed, which makes her the perfect victim. No one would suspect that her symptoms are anything other than grief and trauma. But look at this. Maria pulled out her phone and showed him the research she had compiled on the supplements Catherine had been giving Sophie. These herbal remedies, in the combinations and dosages she's been using, can cause nausea, weakness, digestive problems and neurological symptoms. In a child Sophie's size, the effects would be even more pronounced. David stared at the screen, his face growing pale as he absorbed the information. Maria could see the moment when doubt began to crack his certainty, when the possibility she was presenting started to feel real. Why would Catherine want to hurt Sophie? She's Elena's sister. She loves this family. Does she? Maria asked gently. Or does she love you? The question hit David like a physical blow. Maria saw recognition flicker in his eyes, memories and observations suddenly reorganizing themselves into a different pattern. Catherine's constant presence, her eagerness to help, her suggestions about residential treatment, all of it took on a more sinister cast when viewed through this new lens. Even if what you're suggesting is true, David said slowly, I can't accuse Catherine without absolute proof. She's a pharmaceutical professional with an impeccable reputation. No one would believe. Then we get proof, Maria said. Today, Catherine called this morning and said she's bringing a special lunch for Sophie, something to help with her energy levels. What if we test whatever she brings before Sophie consumes it? David was quiet for a long moment, his lawyer's mind working through the implications of what Maria was proposing. How do we do that without alerting her to our suspicions? We don't let Sophie eat or drink anything Catherine brings until we've had it analyzed. We make an excuse, distract Catherine, and get samples to a lab for testing. That could take days for results. Maria shook her head. I have a friend who works at the community hospital. She can run basic tests for common toxins within a few hours. It won't be court-admissible evidence, but it will tell us if Sophie is in immediate danger. David stood and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where his daughter had collapsed the day before. Maria could see the war being fought behind his eyes, his loyalty to Catherine battling against his growing fear for Sophie's safety. If you're wrong about this, he said finally, if Catherine is innocent, and we're creating suspicion and drama over nothing, it could destroy our family relationships permanently. And if I'm right, Maria replied, and we do nothing, it could destroy Sophie permanently. Or worse. The stark reality of that statement seemed to settle David's internal conflict. He turned back to Maria, his expression resolute. What do you need me to do? They spent the next hour planning their strategy. David would behave normally when Catherine arrived, accepting her offerings graciously while finding ways to delay Sophie's consumption of whatever she brought. Maria would discreetly collect samples and get them to her contact at the hospital for immediate testing. The plan was simple, but Maria knew that execution would be far more complicated. Catherine was intelligent and observant, skilled at reading people's motivations and reactions. If she suspected that they were onto her, she might accelerate her timeline or find ways to deflect suspicion back onto them. At 11:30, Catherine's silver BMW pulled into the circular driveway. Maria watched from an upstairs window as the woman emerged carrying her usual collection of containers and bags. Today she was dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Maria made in 3 months, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile warm and concerned as she approached the front door. Mrs. Patterson let her in, and Maria could hear Catherine's cheerful voice echoing through the foyer as she greeted the housekeeper and asked about Sophie's condition. Everything about her demeanor suggested a caring aunt, concerned about her niece's well-being. "David, you look exhausted," Catherine said as she entered the kitchen where David was waiting. "You really need to take better care of yourself. How can you help Sophie if you're running yourself into the ground?" Maria, cleaning nearby counters, watched David's reaction to Catherine's familiar concern. Now that the possibility of manipulation had been raised, he seemed to be hearing her words differently, recognizing the subtle undermining wrapped in caring language. "I'm managing," David replied, his tone carefully neutral. "What did you bring for Sophie today?" Catherine began unpacking her bags with practiced efficiency, explaining each item as she arranged them. "I've prepared a special protein drink that should help with her energy levels. The formula is designed specifically for children who are dealing with trauma-related appetite loss." Maria noted how Catherine positioned herself as the expert, someone with medical knowledge that David lacked. The woman pulled out a large thermos and several smaller containers, setting them on the counter with proprietary familiarity. "I also brought some vitamin gummies that are easier for children to take than pills, and a homemade soup that Elena used to love when she was feeling unwell. I thought it might comfort Sophie to have something that connects her to her mother." The mention of Elena was calculated, Maria realized, designed to disarm any potential objections David might have. Catherine was using his wife's memory as a weapon, making it emotionally difficult for him to question her motives. Sophie appeared in the kitchen at that moment, drawn by the sound of voices. Maria watched the child's reaction to seeing Catherine, noting the way Sophie's shoulders tensed and her steps slowed as she approached. "There's my beautiful girl," Catherine said warmly, opening her arms for a hug. "I've brought some special treats just for you." Sophie submitted to the embrace but didn't return it, her body remaining rigid in Catherine's arms. When Catherine released her, Sophie immediately moved closer to Maria, as if seeking protection. "I'm not very hungry, Aunt Catherine," Sophie said quietly. "Nonsense, sweetheart. You need to keep your strength up. I've made your favorite strawberry protein drink, and it's packed with all the nutrients you need to help you feel better." Catherine began pouring the pink liquid from her thermos into a glass, her movements confident and practiced. Maria caught David's eye and saw him nod almost imperceptibly, their signal to implement their plan. "Sophie," David said, his voice unusually gentle, "why don't you go wash your hands first? We'll have lunch in a few minutes." As Sophie left the room, David turned to Catherine with what appeared to be casual interest. "This protein drink, where did you get the formula? It might be something I could have prepared regularly if it helps her energy levels." Catherine's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that someone not watching carefully might have missed it. "It's a specialized blend that I've been working on with a colleague who specializes in pediatric nutrition. I'm not sure the formula would be available commercially. Could you get me the name of your colleague? I'd like to speak with them directly about Sophie's nutritional needs." Maria saw Catherine's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She was being asked questions she hadn't anticipated, being pushed to provide details she might not be able to fabricate convincingly. "Of course, though I'm not sure they're taking new patients right now. Let me check with them first." It was a deflection, Maria realized, designed to buy Catherine time to create a believable story or find reasons why David couldn't contact this supposed specialist directly. Sophie returned to the kitchen, her hands clean and her expression still wary. Catherine immediately pushed the glass toward her with maternal insistence. "Here you go, sweetheart. Drink it all up so you can grow big and strong." But before Sophie could reach for the glass, David intervened. "Actually, Catherine,
I was hoping we could sit down together first and discuss Sophie's treatment plan. I've been thinking about what you said regarding residential programs, and I want to understand all our options." Catherine's attention immediately shifted to David, her eyes lighting up with what appeared to be hope. "Of course, David. I've actually been researching several excellent facilities that specialize in childhood trauma." As Catherine launched into her prepared presentation about Swiss treatment centers, Maria quietly moved the protein drink away from Sophie's reach, replacing it with a glass of regular milk. She caught Sophie's grateful glance and gave the child a reassuring smile. During Catherine's lengthy explanation of residential treatment options, Maria managed to collect samples of the protein drink, the vitamin gummies, and the soup Catherine had prepared. She sealed them in small containers and slipped them into her pocket, her heart racing with each covert movement. The conversation stretched on for nearly an hour, with Catherine painting increasingly vivid pictures of the specialized care Sophie could receive in Switzerland. She had clearly done her research, presenting compelling arguments about the benefits of removing Sophie from the environment where her trauma had occurred. "The longer we wait, the harder it becomes," Catherine concluded. "Children Sophie's age are remarkably resilient, but only if they receive proper intervention. Every day we delay treatment is a day she falls further behind in her recovery." David nodded thoughtfully, but Maria could see the skepticism growing in his eyes. Now that he was listening with awareness of Catherine's possible motives, her eagerness to remove Sophie from the house seemed less like medical necessity and more like strategic maneuvering. "I appreciate all the research you've done," David said carefully, "but I think I need to consult with Sophie's current treatment team before making any major decisions." Catherine's smile became slightly strained. "Of course, but we shouldn't delay too long. Some of these programs have waiting lists, and Sophie's condition seems to be deteriorating." "What makes you think her condition is deteriorating?" David asked, his tone sharpening slightly. "Well, the episodes are becoming more frequent, aren't they? Just yesterday she collapsed in the garden, and her appetite is getting worse, her energy levels dropping."
All signs that the current treatment approach isn't working. Maria felt a chill at how easily Catherine catalogued Sophie's symptoms, as if she were proud of her handiwork. The woman was using Sophie's suffering as evidence for her argument, completely unaware that she was actually confessing to causing that very suffering. "Perhaps you're right," David said, his voice carefully controlled. "Why don't you leave the materials about those programs? I'll review them tonight, and we can discuss them further." Catherine seemed satisfied with this response, gathering her things and preparing to leave. But as she reached the kitchen door, she turned back with apparent concern. Sophie didn't finish her protein drink. She really needs the nutrients, especially if she's going to have another episode. "I'll make sure she drinks it later," David assured her. "Thank you for everything you've done for us, Catherine. We couldn't have gotten through this without your support." Catherine beamed at the praise, clearly hearing it as validation of her importance to the family. She kissed Sophie goodbye, another embrace the child endured rather than returned, and finally left the house. As soon as Catherine's car disappeared down the driveway, Maria pulled out her phone and called her contact at the hospital. Carmen Rodriguez had been Maria's friend since high school, and she now worked as a lab technician at the community hospital, where she had access to basic toxicology testing equipment. "Carmen, I need a favor, and it's urgent," Maria said without preamble. "I have samples that I need tested for toxins, and I need the results as quickly as possible." "Maria, what kind of trouble are you in?" "Not me, a child. I think someone is poisoning her, and I need proof before something terrible happens." Carmen was quiet for a moment, then her voice became businesslike. "Bring me the samples. I can run basic screens for common toxins and drugs. It won't be comprehensive, but it should tell us if there's anything obviously dangerous." Maria looked at David, who nodded his agreement. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of Maria's life. She clutched the sample containers in her purse, knowing that they represented Sophie's only chance at justice. If the tests came back negative, she would be exposed as a paranoid troublemaker who had disrupted a grieving family with wild accusations. If they came back positive, she would have the proof needed to save Sophie's life. Carmen met her in the hospital parking lot, her round face serious as she accepted the samples. "How long have you suspected this?" "Weeks. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental, but I needed to be sure before I said anything." "Who do you think is doing this?" "The child's aunt. She's been systematically making Sophie sick while positioning herself as the caring family member who's trying to help." Maria felt the familiar anger rising in her chest. She wants to send Sophie away to residential treatment so she can have a clear path to the father. Carmen's expression darkened with disgust. Using a child as a pawn in some sick romantic game. How can people be so evil? "I don't know, but I'm going to stop her." Carmen squeezed Maria's hand. "Give me 2 hours. I'll call you as soon as I have results." The drive back to the Martinez estate passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Maria found David waiting in his study, Sophie playing quietly nearby under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye. The child looked pale and listless, the effects of months of systematic poisoning evident in her fragile appearance. "How long until we know?" David asked quietly. 2 hours, maybe less." They waited in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what the test results might mean. Maria found herself watching Sophie, noting details she had missed before. The child's hair lacked the shine it should have had, her skin had an unhealthy pallor, and her movements seemed slower than normal for a child her age. How had they all missed the signs? How had trained medical professionals failed to recognize that Sophie's symptoms had a pharmaceutical cause rather than a psychological one? The answer, Maria realized, was that Catherine had chosen her method perfectly. The symptoms she was causing were exactly the ones that would be expected in a grieving, traumatized child. Depression, loss of appetite, digestive problems, fatigue, all could be easily attributed to psychological distress rather than deliberate poisoning. Maria's phone rang at exactly 3 o'clock. Carmen's name appeared on the screen, and Maria answered on the first ring. "Maria, you need to call the police right now." The words sent ice through Maria's veins. "What did you find?" "Multiple substances that have no business being in a child's system. I found traces of diphenhydramine in dangerous concentrations, along with several herbal compounds that can cause nausea and digestive problems. But the worst is what I found in that protein drink." "What was it?" "Ipecac syrup mixed with high doses of magnesium sulfate. That combination would cause violent nausea, vomiting and diarrhea. In a child Sophie's size, consuming the full glass could have put her in the hospital with dehydration and electrolyte imbalances." Maria felt sick with horror and vindication in equal measure. The Ipecac syrup was particularly sinister. It was a substance once used to induce vomiting in poisoning cases, but it had been banned for home use because of its dangerous side effects. "Carmen, can you document all of this officially? Can you provide written results that would hold up legally?" "I'm already printing the reports." "Maria, this isn't just child abuse. This is attempted murder. That woman was systematically destroying that little girl's health, and today's dose could have killed her." David had been watching Maria's face during the phone call, and he approached as she ended the conversation. She looked at him with a mixture of grief and rage, knowing that the next words she spoke would shatter his world completely. "Catherine has been poisoning Sophie. The tests confirm multiple toxic substances in dangerous concentrations. Carmen says today's protein drink could have been fatal." David sank into his chair as if his legs had given out, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally a cold fury that Maria had never seen before. "Call the police," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Call them now." But before Maria could dial, they heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Through the window they could see Catherine's BMW returning, and Maria's blood turned to ice as she realized what this meant. "She's back," Maria whispered. "Why is she back?" David stood slowly, his expression hardening into something that would have frightened Maria if she hadn't known his anger was directed at Catherine rather than her. Because she wants to make sure Sophie drinks that protein shake. She wants to watch it work. The front door opened, and they could hear Catherine's voice calling out cheerfully, "David, I forgot something earlier, and I wanted to check on Sophie." Maria looked at David, seeing her own resolve reflected in his eyes. This was the moment of truth, when all their careful planning would either save Sophie or expose them to Catherine's manipulation and retaliation. "Are you ready for this?" Maria asked quietly. David nodded, his jaw set with determination. "She tried to kill my daughter. I'm more than ready." As Catherine's footsteps approached the study, Maria felt the same fierce protectiveness that had sustained her through every challenge in her own life as a mother. Some battles were too important to lose, and some children were worth any risk. Today she and David would fight for Sophie's life, and they would win. Catherine's heels clicked against the marble floor with confident precision as she made her way through the Martinez mansion, her voice carrying the warm familiarity of someone who considered herself part of the family. Maria stood beside David in his study, both of them frozen in the terrible moment before confrontation, knowing that the next few minutes would determine Sophie's fate. "David, are you in your study?" Catherine called out, her tone bright with artificial cheer. "I realized I left my reading glasses here, and I wanted to make sure Sophie finished that protein drink. The poor darling needs every bit of nutrition she can get." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Maria could see the rage building behind his carefully controlled expression. The casual way Catherine spoke about the poison she had prepared for his daughter, the motherly concern she projected while systematically destroying a child's health, it was almost too monstrous to believe. "In here, Catherine," David called back, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Catherine appeared in the doorway moments later, looking every inch the concerned family member in her expensive suit and perfectly applied makeup. Her smile was warm and genuine, practiced over months of deception, and for a split second, Maria almost doubted her own conclusions. How could someone who looked so caring, so normal, be capable of such calculated cruelty? "There you are," Catherine said, crossing the room to give David what appeared to be an affectionate kiss on the cheek. "I hope Sophie's feeling better after her rest. Sometimes a little nap is all it takes to help these episodes pass." Maria watched David's face carefully, seeing him struggle not to recoil from Catherine's touch. The physical contact that had once seemed like family affection now felt like contamination, knowing what those same hands had been doing to his daughter. "Actually, Catherine, I'm glad you came back," David said, his voice carefully modulated. "Maria and I have been discussing some concerns about Sophie's health, and I think you might be able to help us understand what's been happening." Catherine's smile faltered for just a moment, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been caution, but she recovered quickly, settling into the chair across from David's desk with practiced ease. "Of course, David, you know I'm always here to help. What kind of concerns?" David opened the folder that contained Maria's documentation, spreading the photographs and notes across his desk with deliberate care. Catherine's eyes moved over the materials, and Maria saw her face go very still as she recognized what she was looking at. "We've been tracking Sophie's symptoms," David said quietly. "The timing of her episodes, what she consumed beforehand, the severity of her reactions, and we've noticed some very interesting patterns." Catherine's laugh sounded forced, but she maintained her composed expression. "David, surely you don't think I would do anything to harm Sophie? She's Elena's daughter, she's family. Show her the lab results," Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through Catherine's protestations like a blade. David pulled out the printed reports that Carmen had provided, setting them on the desk where Catherine couldn't avoid seeing them. The scientific language was stark and damning, listing concentrations of toxic substances that had no legitimate reason for being in a child's system. Catherine stared at the papers for a long moment, her face cycling through several emotions before settling into something cold and calculating. When she looked up,
The mask of maternal concern had completely dropped, replaced by something that made Maria's skin crawl. "You had Sophie's food tested," Catherine said, her voice flat with accusation. "You went behind my back and violated my trust." "Your trust?" David's voice rose with barely contained fury. "You've been poisoning my daughter. You've been making her sick, watching her suffer, and using her pain to manipulate me into sending her away." Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. The transformation in her demeanor was shocking. Gone was the caring aunt, replaced by someone Maria barely recognized. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Catherine spat, her voice sharp with venom. "Sophie has been sick because she's traumatized and grieving. Everything I've done has been to help her, to help both of you."
By giving her ipecac syrup, Maria stepped forward, her own anger finally breaking free. By feeding her substances that could have killed her. "That protein drink you brought today contained enough toxins to put her in the hospital." Catherine's eyes snapped to Maria with pure hatred. "You? This is all because of you, isn't it? Some nobody housekeeper poisoning David's mind with paranoid fantasies. You're nothing but a gold digger trying to worm your way into this family." "I'm a mother," Maria replied steadily, "and I recognize child abuse when I see it." The words seemed to strike Catherine like a physical blow. Her face flushed with rage, and Maria saw something unhinged flash in her eyes. "Child abuse? I've spent months caring for that ungrateful little brat while David buried himself in work and guilt. I've been the one bringing her food, medicine, comfort. I've been more of a mother to her than what?" David's voice cut through her tirade like ice. "More than Elena? Is that what you were going to say?" Catherine turned to face him, and Maria saw years of repressed bitterness pouring out of her like poison from a wound. "Yes, more than Elena. Perfect, beloved Elena who never appreciated what she had. Who took you for granted while I watched from the sidelines, loving you, wanting you, knowing I could make you happy in ways she never could." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. David stared at Catherine as if seeing her clearly for the first time, his face a mixture of revulsion and horrified understanding. "You've been in love with me," he said quietly. "This whole time, even when Elena was alive. I've loved you since college," Catherine said, her voice breaking with the weight of years of suppressed emotion. "Before you even met Elena, before she stole you away with her pretty smile and empty chatter. I was the one who understood your ambitions, your dreams. I was the one who would have been perfect for you." Maria felt sick listening to Catherine's delusional justification for her crimes. This woman had convinced herself that love justified everything: stalking, manipulation, and ultimately attempted murder. "So you decided to destroy my daughter to get to me," David said, his voice deadly quiet. "I didn't want to hurt her," Catherine protested, but her words lacked conviction. "I just needed her out of the way temporarily. The residential treatment would have been good for her, given her time to heal while you what? While you convinced me that my daughter was too damaged to come home. While you positioned yourself as my savior and consoler." Catherine's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face, but they looked more like tears of frustration than genuine remorse. "It would have worked," she whispered. "It would have been perfect. Sophie would have gotten better in Switzerland, and you would have realized that I was the one who truly understood you. We could have been happy, David. We could have had the life we were meant to have." "By poisoning a child," Maria said, her voice filled with disgust. "By making an 8-year-old suffer so you could play out your sick romantic fantasy." Catherine whirled on her again, her face contorted with rage. "You don't understand anything. You're just a servant who stumbled into something far beyond your comprehension. David and I have history, connections you could never understand." "What I understand," Maria replied, stepping closer, "is that you're a predator who targeted a vulnerable child. What I understand is that you belong in prison." As if summoned by her words, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the estate. David had called the police while Catherine was ranting, and Maria felt a surge of relief knowing that help was finally coming. Catherine heard the sirens too, and her eyes went wide with panic. She looked around the study as if searching for an escape route, but Maria and David were blocking the doorway, and the windows were too high for her to consider jumping. "You called the police," Catherine said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "You actually called the police on family." "You're not family," David replied coldly. "Family doesn't poison children. Family doesn't use a grieving little girl as a pawn in their sick games." The sirens were getting closer now, and Catherine seemed to realize that her carefully constructed fantasy was collapsing around her. She sank back into her chair, her face pale and her hands shaking. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered. "I just wanted you to need me. I wanted to be important to you." "You were important to me," David said quietly. "Elena loved you like a sister, and I trusted you with my daughter's life. You destroyed all of that with your obsession." The police arrived moments later, and Maria watched with grim satisfaction as they took Catherine into custody. The woman who had tormented Sophie for months was finally being held accountable for her crimes, led away in handcuffs while protesting her innocence to anyone who would listen. Detective Sarah Chen, who took their statements, was thorough and professional in her questioning. She examined Maria's documentation with careful attention, praising the detailed record-keeping that had made the case against Catherine so clear. "Without your observations and evidence collection," Detective Chen told Maria, "this woman might have succeeded in seriously harming or even killing that little girl. You potentially saved a life today." As the police finished their investigation and Catherine was taken to jail, Maria found herself alone with David in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. The man who had been so controlled and distant for months was now openly weeping, the weight of what had almost happened to his daughter finally hitting him. "I almost lost her," he said through his tears. "I was so focused on protecting her from emotional pain that I nearly let someone kill her physically. What kind of father does that make me?" "A human one," Maria replied gently. "You were grieving and vulnerable, and Catherine took advantage of that. But you listened when someone tried to warn you, and you acted to protect Sophie when it mattered. That's what good fathers do." They were interrupted by the sound of small footsteps in the hallway, and Sophie appeared in the doorway of the study, her dark eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Daddy, why were there police cars here? Where did Aunt Catherine go?" David knelt down to Sophie's level, his face still streaked with tears but his voice steady as he spoke to his daughter. "Sweetheart, Aunt Catherine was making you sick. She was putting bad things in your food and drinks, and that's why you've been feeling so terrible." Sophie's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then relief so profound it took Maria's breath away. "I knew something was wrong," Sophie whispered. "I was scared of her, but I didn't know why. She always wanted me to eat things that made me feel bad." "You're safe now," David promised, and for the first time in months he opened his arms to his daughter. "She can't hurt you anymore." Sophie flew into his embrace, and Maria watched with tears in her eyes as father and daughter finally reconnected. The physical contact that David had denied them both for so long was healing in ways that no therapy or medicine could match. "I missed hugging you, Daddy," Sophie sobbed into his shoulder. "I thought you didn't love me anymore." "I never stopped loving you," David whispered, holding her tighter than he had since Elena's funeral. "I was scared and made terrible choices, but I love you more than anything in the world. I promise I'll never leave you alone again." Over the following weeks, as Catherine awaited trial and Sophie began the real process of healing, the Martinez household underwent a complete transformation. David took a leave of absence from his company to focus entirely on his daughter's recovery, and Maria found herself becoming not just an employee but a true member of their family. Sophie's physical health improved dramatically once the poisoning stopped. Her appetite returned, her energy levels stabilized, and the mysterious episodes that had plagued her for months disappeared entirely. But more importantly, her emotional healing began in earnest as she rediscovered the security of her father's love. David threw himself into learning how to be the parent Sophie needed, working with therapists to understand how to support a child through trauma and grief. He began reading bedtime stories again, helping with homework, and most importantly, he learned to offer physical comfort without fear. The no hugs rule was officially abolished, replaced by a household full of warmth and affection. Sophie bloomed under this new attention, her personality emerging from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long. Maria watched this transformation with deep satisfaction, knowing that she had played a crucial role in saving not just Sophie's life, but the entire family's capacity for love and connection. Her own relationship with them evolved beyond employer and employee into something that felt like extended family. One evening, as Maria was preparing to leave for her small apartment, Sophie caught her in the hallway with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Maria, are you going to stay with us forever?" Maria knelt down to the child's level, smiling at the hope in Sophie's dark eyes. "I don't know about forever, Maya, but I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon." "Good," Sophie said, wrapping her arms around Maria in the kind of spontaneous hug that had once been forbidden in this house. "I love you too much for you to leave." "I love you too, sweetheart," Maria replied, meaning every word. David appeared at the end of the hallway, having overheard their conversation. His expression was thoughtful as he approached them. "Actually, Maria, I've been meaning to talk to you about your future here," he said. "Mrs. Patterson is planning to retire soon, and I was wondering if you might be interested in becoming Sophie's full-time caregiver, not as a housekeeper, but as someone who helps me raise her properly." Maria felt tears welling in her eyes at the offer. It would mean financial security for herself and Diego, but more importantly, it would allow her to continue being part of Sophie's healing journey. "I would be honored," she said quietly. 6 months later, at Catherine's trial, Maria testified about the systematic poisoning she had witnessed and documented. Catherine's defense attorney tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, a woman with her own agenda who had manipulated the situation for personal gain. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Catherine's own recorded confession sealed her fate. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder and child endangerment, finally facing the consequences of her obsession. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Sophie slipped her hand into Maria's, looking up at her with the bright, healthy eyes of a child who had been saved just in time. "Are we going home now?" she asked. "Yes, Maya," Maria replied, squeezing her small hand gently. "We're going home." David walked beside them, no longer the broken, isolated man who had been drowning in grief and fear. He had learned that love wasn't something to be rationed or withheld out of fear. It was something to be given freely, even when it meant risking pain. The Martinez mansion was no longer a museum of perfect surfaces and emotional emptiness. It had become a real home, filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of messy, beautiful chaos that comes with genuine family life. And in the garden where Sophie had once collapsed from Catherine's poison, she now played freely, her shrieks of delight echoing off the walls as David chased her through the flower beds, both of them covered in dirt and grinning with pure joy. Maria watched from the kitchen window as she prepared their dinner, her heart full with the knowledge that sometimes the most broken families could be healed by the simplest things: truth, courage, and the willingness to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Because love, Maria had learned, wasn't just about hugs and kisses, though those were important. Love was about showing up, paying attention, and refusing to let evil triumph over innocence. It was about being brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths and strong enough to protect the vulnerable, even when it meant risking everything. In the end, the billionaire's rule against hugs had been replaced by something far more powerful: the understanding that physical affection was not a luxury or a weakness, but a fundamental human need that no child should ever be denied. And as Sophie ran into the house, breathless from play and covered in garden soil, David scooped her up in his arms for the kind of spontaneous embrace that had once been forbidden. Her giggles filled the air as he spun her around, both of them finally free from the prison of fear that had kept them apart. Maria smiled as she called them in for dinner, knowing that this was what family looked like, not perfect, not without challenges, but built on a foundation of love, trust, and the commitment to never let anyone hurt the people who mattered most. The no hugs rule was just a memory now, replaced by a household where affection flowed freely and healing happened one embrace at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.